and welcome to the Whiny Mom Podcast, the judgment-free zone where moms can be real with each other, where we can share our struggles, where we can laugh at all the ridiculous moments we find ourselves in every day. Hello, all you whiny moms. Thank you for joining us this time. How are you doing tonight, Jay?
I'm doing good. Sunday, getting ready for Monday in the week.
We don't usually record on Sunday. It's a little bit different.
Yeah, this is
all right.
This is the first.
Well, I'm super excited because tonight we're going to explore a topic that I enjoy very much, which is a historical topic. Be discussing what mothering was like throughout the ages, through all of human history, how the roles of mothers and the relationship with their children kind of just like changed and shaped from time period and culture to culture. So super excited about that. Before we get into it, though, however, seeing is right now us Americans are understandably preoccupied by the very near, potentially historic election coming up. We thought it might be interesting to take a few minutes to talk about some of the most unusual elections in our U.S. past, and it does kind of fit with our history theme. So, like, this isn't the only time that our elections have been this wild. So, Jay, do you want to talk about the first couple?
So in 1824, we had a four-way race between John Quincy Adams versus Andrew Jackson versus William H. Crawford and House Speaker Henry Clay.
There's a typo. It's supposed to say run. You're fine.
Okay. When a runoff, sorry, let me start over again. When a runoff of Congress was mandated after no man won enough votes to secure the election, Clay dropped out and endorsed Adams. Being the Speaker of the House, he was able to sway enough House members to elect Adams. Adams made Clay his Secretary of State, and it deemed the corruption compromise. Fast forward 4 years, and in 1828, Jackson and Adams faced off again. And Adams was accused of pimping out young women in Russia.
I'm sorry, that's just like something that someone would say about a politician now, right?
Right, sounds accurate. And he was a former ambassador, and Jackson's wife was accused of polygamy as she was still finalizing her divorce from her first husband when she married Jackson. Jackson narrowly won, but his wife died a few weeks after the election, sadly, of a heart attack.
That's so sad.
The writers at the Jackson's inauguration were only placated when liquor was put out on the White House lawn for them to drink.
Like, I didn't double check. Like, I heard, I got that from one source, and that is so ridiculous. Like, if it's true.
That's insane.
I want to reiterate, we're not historians. This is just information that I've gathered just kind of like for fun. So, but isn't that crazy?
That is super crazy. I mean, free drinks, right?
I know, but I think it's funny that made them stop rioting, because like, would that make it worse?
Like,
what kind of liquor was it? God.
So, next one was in the year 1920. Debs, who had been arrested for speaking out and demonstrating against World War I, ran under the Socialist Party from prison. And he won 3.5% of the vote from prison, you guys. Or 900,000 votes. And after his loss, President Harding commuted his sentence.
Other notable presidential controversies. 1968 was another big one. Basically, President Johnson declined to seek re-election amid Vietnam. So his vice president ended up taking over, but not until the Democratic Convention that year. And that's where they nominated him. During this time, everything was so like controversial that there were actually riots going on outside during the convention, which soon to be President Nixon used against the Democratic Party and ran under a law and order campaign. And that's why Nixon was elected president, guys.
Wow.
Yeah, right. Johnson should have, I guess, just run. I don't know. I don't really know the situation. I wasn't alive. But I just thought it was like pretty interesting how volatile it was. And then, of course, in 2000, this one I remember because I was like a kid. I didn't realize, though, the conclusion. So back in 2000, Florida's vote was so close that they kept recounting it because they couldn't determine if Bush or Gore was the winner because they had like these little punch cards and they called them hanging chads that they couldn't tell if they'd been punched or if it was because people were handling them so much if the thing had come out. So they were having trouble counting. And eventually there was a Supreme Court case and the Supreme Court told them they had to finish their count by December 12th. So on December 12th, wherever the count was, that was just what it was, whether or not
they got all the votes or not.
Yeah, so Bush got the votes and won the presidency. And that's how he became president. It's crazy, huh?
Crazy.
Absolutely crazy. So, yeah, we're not necessarily the only time period that's had crazy, dramatic presidential elections. I thought that was kind of interesting. But now that that's out of the way, we can get to our real historic topic for tonight. Mothering through the ages. And I wanted to start out with something kind of fun, the etymology of the word mom. I don't know if you've ever like heard about it, but people usually say, oh, it's just because that's what a baby says, mom, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's true, but there's also a lot more to it. So the word mother is a Latin root mater. You get words like matriarch out of that, which kind of makes sense. Right. But then for mom, it's like the mama sound the baby is making. So yeah, that's true. But that's also where we got the word mammal from for animals who secrete milk for their young to drink. And the word mammary, like the mammary gland. Your mammary means your boobs.
Right.
So mom means boob.
Boob. Well.
Isn't that silly? You just go around calling your mom boob.
Well, that's all we are to them when they're first born.
I didn't breastfeed.
Oh yeah, that's true. Not to everybody.
I tried my first time. The second time I was like, I'm good. It's just that's like very funny. Okay. I'm an adult. We're gonna move on. So basically, if you go back all the way back to like our hunter-gatherer roots, we don't have a lot of archaeological evidence. Obviously, this is a super freaking long time ago, and they didn't have structures and they didn't have writing, so it's hard. But they do find like grave sites and they find dwellings like in caves, and there is some stuff that was left behind. From what we can tell, though, in this time period, men were more likely to be the hunters. Women were more likely to stay near camp, maintain camp, gather stuff, cook, raise any kind of like, if they'd had domesticated pets or if they did any kind of like very early farming, which at that time period, not really. They would help like things like fishing and stuff like that. But I think it makes sense because if they were like having kids, they probably needed to stay near them. Especially like if they were pregnant, you wouldn't really want to be going out hunting. So that makes sense.
Right.
This time period, from what they could tell, and this is going to be kind of a theme going forward, is people raise their children in a communal fashion. So they would take turns watching the kids, and your neighbors, your family relations would all kind of like help you be in charge of them. And it wasn't like you were just watching your kids. Because there was a lot to do back then, you know? So, you know, kind of just basic stuff. That moved into the Neolithic area where humans began farming and setting up permanent settlements. Women did a lot of the farming alongside the men and a lot of tending to the livestock. They were often in charge of brewing beer and, of course, making clothing, which turns out to be a really big theme going forward. Making cloth, making clothing.
Gosh, can you imagine so much work?
Right? Well, the amount of time it would take too, just to weave the cloth, like spin the thread, weave the cloth, all of that, it took hours and hours and hours to make a garment. Like they basically just did that all the time. They're just constantly doing it.
And here we are, us whiny boobs, whining about stuff.
Laundry. At least we don't have to make our own laundry soap, huh? Carry our water in from outside. So mothering during this period was still mostly communal from what we know, but family units became more pronounced depending on the culture. Women would begin to take on the role of managing the household more so, including children, alongside servants and slaves throughout history. Prominent cultures that kind of came out of this time period, you want to think about like the ancient Egyptians, the ancient Chinese, the ancient Persians, and they did kind of vary quite a bit. So ancient Chinese culture was more prominent gender roles. Women weren't given much freedom outside of the home, but it did vary depending on, like, China, it's thousands of years. So it varied from dynasty to dynasty, but just kind of overall. As the role of managing a household and producing goods for the family took up most of a woman's time, regardless of her class, mothering was done by herself as well as by elder children or by other family, and still somewhat communal, unless you were very rich, in which case it'd be done by a servant or a slave if you had those in your household that you were managing. Now, Egypt and Persia are a little bit different. Because in Egypt and Persia, women had a lot more freedom and a lot more autonomy. So, like, have you seen the sequel to 300?
I don't think I have.
So, there's a woman, Artemisia, who's depicted, and she was a real person. She was really an admiral in the Persian army.
Mm-hmm.
And they had like women captains and admirals and like pretty high up ranking military people. It's pretty interesting because that's kind of unique throughout history. And to have it so like documented and we know for sure that it happened, it's kind of cool.
That is pretty cool.
So in Egypt, they didn't have like female military officers necessarily, but they were able to, just like Persians, they were able to own property. They were able to, in Egypt, divorce their husbands for pretty much no reason, which is kind of unheard of. They were able to have abortions. If also, like, apparently in their culture, like if you got pregnant out of wedlock, it wasn't like a taboo. I don't know if that's necessarily true, but I did see it a couple of times. Like they were just happy that a baby was going to be born and they weren't like super hung up on it, which is really interesting. But women could be scribes, they could own businesses, they could do all kinds of stuff. So they just couldn't be like leaders necessarily.
Right.
So for children and child rearing, that basically meant that the children, again, their moms didn't really have time to like raise them and dote on them. So children would be in the home with their family. And pretty much it's like a repeating pattern. If you had servants, your servants raised the kids for you. If you didn't have servants, the older siblings might help raise the kids and you would just kind of do what you could. They had a lot of like free time to go wander around. Which I thought was really interesting that just kept coming up. Because like when you think back to history, you don't necessarily think about that.
Right.
But it kind of makes sense. Another theme I saw that was like really prevalent was in war times or places that were like really warring. Women would go out and be gone on long campaigns. Women had a lot more freedom.
Yeah.
Which, what?
I mean, it's kind of like the servant thing. I kind of relate it to like rich people, you know?
Yeah.
That have like the nannies just basically raising their kid while they're out, you know?
That's like exactly what it is.
Yeah. So
it hasn't changed much. Greece was fascinating though, because they have two very different, well, every city-state was different. So they had Sparta and Athens. Everyone's heard about Sparta and Athens. Athens was like very misogynistic and like women weren't allowed to go outside without like a male family member. And well, in ancient times, at least, like in this specific period, they were very much like stayed at home, couldn't like really own property in their own name. So like if they were the only heir to their dad's money, the family would have them divorce their husband and marry someone back in their own family, apparently. so that
Like
they
a
could
relative?
like an uncle or a cousin or something, so they could keep the
Oh,
family wealth. Because if she inherited, her husband would just get it.
right.
Which I think that sounds insane, but
That's
it
craziness.
kept coming up. I kept finding that in different places. I'm like, really? And Sparta, however, though, because they were a more wartime place, I think this is kind of why this is happening. It wasn't like that. So they were able to have like a lot more rights and a lot more like respect, I guess. They were able to do more, but they weren't like the Egyptians. Like, don't get me wrong. Their children, though, like basically, like if they cheated on their husband and they were like, it's so that I can have a stronger baby, they didn't get in trouble because they wanted them to have strong kids. Yeah,
Right.
like if they weren't having a kid with their husband, they were like just wanted them to have kids. So I thought that was weird.
I just
But like
wanted to build some warriors.
right when the kids were like 8, I think they would go off to military school and they would like be in military school until they were like in their 20s.
That's insane.
Isn't that
Well,
insane?
they didn't really parent their kids then.
No, they didn't. Well, they did when they were like really, really little, and then by the time they would normally like
Right.
around the time they'd be like in school age.
Like our kids would be in military school.
Yeah. Well, not the girls. That was like there was less information. You know, checks out. They probably just stayed at home and helped their mom manage the house. Like that's like what everyone else did.
Right.
They did train them though to fight, the girls. But I think it's the same reason why that happened in other cultures. Like just because the men are away, you have to be able to like defend yourself, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
So that was like pretty interesting. One other thing of note though, Athens, that's where like Socrates, Aristotle, and Plato came from, and they're like really famous philosophers. And in the Middle Ages, they're going to be important again. So I'll talk about them again in a minute. So we're going to talk about the next period, kind of like the Middle Ages. And here you get like Norse and like barbarian civilizations, like the British civilizations. And they kind of remind me of like the Persians and the Spartans because it was similar. Women could divorce. There were shield maidens, which is kind of controversial, but there is archaeological evidence that shield maidens did exist. They're not sure if they would go out on Viking raids or if they were just like more protecting the homeland or really what they did, but they were real. So they had women warriors too.
Okay.
Their children also kind of just raised themselves. But the women would actually teach them. They were responsible for homeschooling, for teaching them to fight, because men, especially if men were away, they weren't always away, but when they were in charge of producing all the goods for a family. So clothing, food, gardening, livestock, brewing beer, all of it. So they were some, I don't know, like badass women, honestly.
Very.
It's like a fucking lot. Them and the Egyptians, I feel like they were just like, I feel like I relate to them. They were very overworked. Oh my God, right? Like I'm reading some of this stuff and I'm like, oh, honey, yeah, it's always been this way.
Yeah, that's like 10 times worse back then.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, absolutely. Like, dang, I don't know.
I couldn't do it.
It's a lot. So where was I? I totally just got lost. Oh, I was going to talk about also like some other cultures during the time period. So like Rome, obviously, during the middle period, they kind of came out of Greek. So they were similar in the way that women were treated, not as good as the Norse. Children were raised mostly at home. They would go to like trade schools. And that was another common thing. Like when your child got old enough, you would send them to like one of your neighbors' houses who might know a trade, or they would like start working with you and your husband, who during the Middle Ages, women would just like they did what their husband did. So they were blacksmiths, they were farmers, they were traders, they were like whatever their husband did, they would just help them with it because it's like everybody had their own business, more or less. A lot of people were farmers. So a lot of like time you'd be spending teaching your kid how to do your trade.
It's like a family thing. That's pretty cool though.
It is like to think about. That's really interesting. But you would be responsible for teaching them to like read and write and stuff and all of that if you knew how yourself. Okay, back to the philosophers. Okay, so they were from Athens, so they were super misogynistic and thought that women like couldn't do anything. And during the Middle Ages, the classics were the stuff that the books that they wrote. That was what they used as textbooks. That and the Bible. So that's why Europe was like that.
Came from them.
Thanks, Socrates. You suck. Maybe not him specifically, but like that whole like way of thinking was the Athenian, which moved to Roman, which moved to medieval Europe, which moved to America. Like you see how like that idea spreads.
Yeah.
Another cool one was the Aztecs, and the way that they raised their kids was kind of cool. Because in Aztec culture, they had mandated school. So they would actually send their kids to school. Other than that, they were pretty much like all the other medieval people. Like they did the same stuff. It's like different place, same stuff. They were all, I was really shocked at how similar all the cultures really were. The only difference was if women worked in the home or if they were allowed to work outside of the home. But they were all working. They were all very busy. They were all doing all the stuff.
Right.
So like, but yeah, boys and girls would both go to school. It was like high school though. And they would all be taught to read and write to some degree or do some like, I don't know exactly what they taught them.
So they only went to school as like teenagers during their teenage years?
Okay. Yeah. During their teenage
adulthood, basically kind of thing.
Yeah. Like they would learn how to like do all the life skills first. And then they would go and learn how to like do their basic, whatever their basic education was. I'm not going to pretend like I know exactly what it was. I didn't write it down and I don't remember, so I don't want to misspeak. I believe they did learn how to write though. Anyway, so that was pretty cool. And if they were rich, they got to go to like rich people's school. So they separated those as well.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, super interesting. Another thing that was kind of cool was like throughout even like the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages periods, prostitutes were very much legal. The upper class ones were more like concubines. But if you were a prostitute, like in ancient Greece, you actually had more freedoms. You could like live on your own and you could actually obtain your own wealth if you were like a high class one.
Right.
Super weird, right?
Yeah.
So I found like a lot of the stuff I was researching, I started researching like children and how children's lives were, because that was the only way I could get any of the information. Is everyone wanted to just talk about like queens and like famous people, which I was trying to get to like everyday life. So it was difficult, but fascinating. Next is colonial industrial revolution. So like this was a hard time period. This was by far, the Industrial Revolution was the worst time period to be alive. Like it was awful because they took basically what women did in the home, all of the manufacturing of household goods and stuff, and they started doing it in factories. And since women forever had been like spinning and weaving, that's why women worked in the textile mills.
Oh, okay.
Because that was where it went to. So they would go there and they'd work like 12 plus hour days, 6-7 days a week, every day. And then their kids would join them in the factory, sometimes as young as like 5 years old.
Just running around?
No, working.
Oh my God.
Under strict conditions. And this continued until like, honestly, until the turn of the 1900s and like into the 1900s. It didn't get abolished mostly in America until 1920 because there weren't enough jobs for men because of the Depression. Because children had too many jobs. Like they were working in coal mines, which I'm sure you've seen pictures of that.
Yeah.
It's just like freaking dark. Like that was what childhood and motherhood was for like 80 years, 100 years. Was you would have your kids and then you would go work in the factories together or separately and that was it. And you would just do that all day, every day. Just so you could not starve. And it was dangerous. Like kids got their hands crushed and their legs cut off and died.
Yeah.
It was really fucking awful. Like it was disgusting. That was really hard to read about. But finally it came to an end. Unless you were rich. See, if you were rich, that's the Victorian era. That's when they had the doting moms, stay-at-home moms who all of a sudden they didn't have to do so much work anymore because manufacturing was a thing. So they didn't have to make all their own clothes. They didn't have to grow all their own food.
Yeah.
They had it like better
They had
Like
it
everyone
made.
else had it so bad. And
They
that,
had the slaves and stuff cooking and cleaning and doing all the work for them.
well, and then, yeah, in colonial America and other parts of the world where slavery was still going on during this time period too. But even if they didn't, like if you were just staying at home with, maybe you had a couple servants or whatever, you didn't have to do as much work because you weren't producing, you weren't like making all your own stuff anymore. You could buy some of that or like have some of it at least mostly pre-made.
Mm-hmm.
You could make clothing, but you didn't have to make the cloth. You didn't have to shear the sheep. You didn't have to grind the grain. Oh, and this is cool. So last names like Brewster, Baxter, those mean female brewer and female baker.
Oh, what?
Because that was like their female professions. Also, spinster, if you call someone a spinster, someone who doesn't get married, that just means female spinner.
Okay.
That's cool, huh?
That's interesting. Yeah.
I'm sure there's like more, like Webster is also female weaver. Web,
like the Webster Dictionary.
Yeah, I'm almost certain that that's one of them too. I could just be conflating, but I think that that's true. Because I think that's Old English for weaver, because spider web means they're weavers in Old English. Anyway, I'm like way off topic right now. I think, like, in conclusion, basically is they came out of that Victorian age and we left the Industrial Revolution. People got workers' rights. They got 5-day work week, 40-hour work week, all that good stuff. And then we went through the Depression, and that kind of forced children out and a lot of women out of the workforce. Then they came to like this modern period where lower middle class and middle class women were at home with very little to do compared to how we'd had the history of our lives. And that is where we get the modern idea of the stay-at-home wife, where she is devoted solely to her children. Doing things like homeschooling, that's something that goes way back, very traditional. But when people could send their kids to school, they did, even in the Victorian age. So that's kind of like what people, I feel like, just be an extra sometimes, depending on your circumstance, whatever. But this idea is very new and it was very fleeting. And I think we're kind of on the other side of that now, where now we're expected to go back to work.
Yeah.
Do you have some thoughts? I have a couple of things I forgot I want to talk about, but I want to hear what you have to say. I like blitzed through that.
Yeah, you did.
I was so excited. I'm going to talk about the things I forgot to talk about real quick while you think about it.
Okay.
I completely forgot about an election thing.
Going way back.
Going way back to the beginning. Okay, this is fucking wild. Have you heard about how India runs their elections?
I read a little bit about it.
I can't believe that I forgot to talk about this. Okay, so I was trying to do like crazy elections throughout the world, but that was like honestly just way too fucking much. But I just had to tell you about this. India holds elections every 5 years, and not only are they the most populated countries in the world, but they also have quite high voter turnout, like over 66% in 2014, which is really high for considering how many people there are. So they have to have a polling place no further than 2 kilometers from every citizen, which means there is a polling place set up in a remote jungle. So one priest who mans a temple in the middle of nowhere can come vote. And they set him up his own poll. That is so different from how we do things here.
Yeah.
Like that. They're like, they want them to vote, right?
Right.
They hire 11 million election workers. A lot of them do work security because they've had issues with that in the past. And voting takes place over a month with results not being released until the last vote is cast. Very different than how we do it because they don't want to influence each other.
Right.
So like, I'm like, by the time I vote, the East Coast has already been called. And I'm like, oh, cool. Thanks, guys. That was just like freaking fascinating. I couldn't believe that they like even can pull something like that off. Anyway, another cool thing about, just fun fact, is midwives and wet nurses. So this is another thing that's weird, is like women in the past would use wet nurses because they didn't even breastfeed their own kids if they didn't have to.
Oh my gosh.
They were literally not even moms. I'm just kidding. So that was like a very common practice in the past, was women would be, that was like a profession. It's very interesting. And then midwives. Now, midwives had some of the most medical experience because like the most common medical procedure is childbirth throughout history. So midwives weren't just for childbirth. They would actually kind of like just local doctors. They would help with other things too. And they knew more about it, had more experience and all that good stuff. So they would actually, there are like cases of them teaching male physicians in universities that women weren't allowed to attend.
Oh, wow.
At certain times in the Middle Ages. And then it got to a point where you had to have a license to be a doctor, and women weren't, it was more difficult for them to get these like degrees to be physicians just because of the views in a lot of places on women. So they would like pay for them. And I think like, I honestly think this is why doctors are males and nurses are females, why that stereotype persists still today.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Right. Because like what do nurses do? They actually do most of the patient work.
Most of the work. Yeah.
But they have a lower level of college degree. Right.
Right.
It sounds fishy to me. I feel like that might be the origin of that. I have to stop now. I have to stop.
How do you want to, are we ending this, or is there more we're talking about?
Did you have any thoughts or like anything you want to talk about more?
I just think it's interesting, the different roles that we have taken on throughout, the ages and how it compares to modern life now.
Yeah. I thought it was like not what I expected it to be, but also it was more familiar than I was thinking it was going to be.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is the same, except for now, I mean, we're still expected to work. And I feel like at that, back in the day, in these different eras, we were still doing work, yeah, whether it was at home or outside of the home.
Yeah, it was like such a fleeting, small period of time. But that's what I feel like I at least associate with, because that was like our grandmas, our moms, our great grandmas. That's like what we're most familiar with. But that was such an anomaly in history.
Right.
It's crazy to think about. Another thing like I found kind of interesting was how different the ancient world was from like the eras preceding ours. Like the Middle Ages and the Renaissance and the Industrial Revolution, just like how different ancient cultures were in terms of like just like male and female equality. Like I wasn't really expecting to find that much of it, but if you go back far enough, the world was a lot different back then. But I don't think they could really afford to not have women doing those jobs is what it came down to, because they were like just surviving. We were talking like 1,000 plus to like 3,000 years ago,
Yeah. I mean, we still have, nowadays we have women generals and women that go into the army, women snipers. Like, it's not something that's new to us, Well,
that being said, there's a lot, and there's so much more I wanted to talk about. Like I got in deep with like the Aztec children, and like for some reason the account that I was looking at was super detailed. So like they found like some really cool sources or what, but I found a couple really detailed, just like about everyday Aztec life, and like that's fascinating. But
that's interesting because they must have really documented their stuff,
Yeah, like a lot of cultures didn't. The problem I kept running into is they didn't document the lives of everyday people very much. So what we have to go on is very, very scarce.
Right.
But I guess maybe the Aztecs did. I don't know.
I mean, there's a lot of ancient Aztec history, which explains maybe, why, we have so much history on them, is because they documented that and they made it a point to learn how to write. And
that might be why. Because they did go to school, and so there were more people who knew how. Man, you might be onto something. That actually makes a lot of sense.
Right.
Like they were even talking about like the clothes they wore on one thing I was watching, and it was talking about like kids didn't wear like underwear when they were little, which makes sense. But the boys apparently weren't expected to wear underwear until they were like 7. They just wore like a ghost sheet, and I'm like, is that real?
Can you imagine?
Like it covered them. But yeah, isn't that funny?
That's hilarious.
The girls had to put their pants on when they were like 5. The boys didn't put their pants on for several more years. Apparently, I don't know.
Apparently.
Okay. So with that, I guess we're gonna close it out. I hope that was enjoyable to everyone. I hope that was intelligible to everyone. I feel like I kind of just couldn't stop. So,
your whiny mom's history session.
So exciting! It's so much fun to like learn about. But yeah, so if you like what we do here, like, subscribe, follow us on Instagram. We're on TikTok. We're on Facebook. Yeah, hope you join us again next time. Good night, everyone. Love you.
Good night. Love you.